If you're hearing this, I'm already dead. I say that first because the document I hold is not rumor. It is a stack of records, timestamps, and signed manifests. I have verified what I can. Flight data tapes, mission logs with tail numbers, radar primary returns from 3 separate sites, medical scans that were later altered. Names are changed, some timestamps are blacked out. I list what is redacted and why. Unit designators, exact coordinates inside a secured grid, and the surnames of anyone still alive on active duty. I keep the technical identifiers intact. They matter. I checked the flight data recorder against the base's ASR feed. I pulled the raw pulse time series and ran it against the operator transcript. I obtained the maintenance logs for the navigation suite and a photo of the terminal that was supposed to be sealed. I interviewed 2 witnesses on the record and 3 who agreed only if I agreed to change their names. I filed FOIA requests where possible and received denials citing national security. I am transparent about method because credibility is the currency here. This is not a thriller. It is a sequence of instrument failures and corroborated anomalies. The first stake is simple. Instruments, not people, notice this first. A radar operator marks a coherent primary where no aircraft should be. A GPS solution reports being 40 meters underground. A thermal camera reports temperature spikes that make no physical sense. These are not poetic metaphors. They are logged numbers that do not obey our physics. I am publishing them because institutional pathways did not and will not resolve the discrepancy. Normal channels mean briefing papers, inspector general reviews, court of inquiry. Those channels folded. Messages were rerouted, evidence was refiled, promotions and transfers followed. Silence is the tool of containment. There is a second stake, containment as policy. The pattern I am seeing implies deliberate engineering, not random occurrence. When a system appears to be using nuclear output as a dimensional stabilizer, the first decision for a military bureaucracy is not to expose it. The first decision is to bind it. Bind, contain, awaken. Those are bureaucratic verbs. They come with orders, and orders come with costs. Human costs, memory costs, time costs. The records hint at an accounting ledger where lives are debited and facility reliability credited. I vouch for the authenticity of the physics logs. I vouch for the continuity of chain of custody for the flight tapes I hold. I do not vouch for motives behind the redactions. I document them. I do not speculate about national strategy. I say only what instruments show and what people told me on the record. I let the data do the work. The hum on a transformer coil registers as a periodic amplitude modulation at 27.3 Hz. That hum correlates to a radar return anomaly at 0.2 microsecond leading edge. That correlation is repeatable. It appears in 3 independent sensor suites. Sensors do not conspire. People do. You will hear the operative testify in their own words. The operative is a navigator. Their logbook is stamped with the base, the flight, and the time. Their unit patch is described in the operative's testimony. I have redacted what could end their life before this was ever broadcast. I have kept the concrete, tail numbers, rack IDs, the model of the INS, the serial of the radar processor. I have cross-checked serials with depot records. I have traced power signatures to a substation that is catalogued on paper as decommissioned. We cannot route this through normal channels because the normal channel altered the medical scans. The normal channel repackaged witness statements. The normal channel reclassified the raw radar feed as exercise data, and then archived it under a name that did not exist the day it was recorded. When I asked why, the answer was procedural. Safety, risk, national interest. Procedural answers are not by themselves lies. They are the architecture of lies. They make containment plausible and accountability impossible. This recording is a handoff. It is a bridge from public record to direct testimony. What follows is not my speculation. What follows is the operative's testimony. I have edited only for clarity, for the sake of the listener, and to remove identifying information that would endanger lives. I keep the technical minutiae, instrument readouts, the smell in the hatch, the grit under gloves, the metallic taste left by ionized air. Those details are not color. They are clues. Listen to the instruments first. They will tell you what humans refuse to admit. The operative speaks in past tense and with the technical cadence of someone who has read the wiring diagrams, who has read the plates, who knows the difference between a reactor feed and a generator output. They will name console IDs. They will name the system plate I could not make public. They will tell you step by step how the radar was painted by something that was not weather. They will tell you what costs the system demanded in return for its containment. They will tell you who did not come home whole. What follows is the operative's testimony. I was a navigator. My clearance read TS-SCI with compartmented code strings on 2 pages of my record. The mission date in my log was 2018-06-02. The manifest stamped my unit as a provisional element attached to a larger program. On paper, our cover story read Radiological Survey and Material Accountability. The base coordinates I wrote down then, 38.9531 degree, 77.4565 degree, were the only thing in that file the Inspector General didn't try to scrub. I carried an INS card, a flight log, and a dog-eared photograph of a house with a porch light on. I carried everything that would matter later in the order you would check a cockpit before takeoff. My unit patch was unofficial, a white delta over a black field. Our legal paperwork used a different UTA signifier. Our pay records used another. That confusion was the first bureaucratic clue. 3 labels for 1 organism. Our team was 5 on the manifest and 5 in practice. First, Rig, EOD Tech, age 38, Marine Corps origin, explosives specialist. He carried linear-shaped charges, a portable X-ray imager, and a field kit for thermochemical cutting. He liked the smell of cutting dust and would light a cigarette after a job. He had a hand tremor I would later learn was radiation-induced, but at the time I called it fatigue. Second, linguist. Contract employee, mid-40s, background in Slavic dialects and signal analysis. She carried a laptop with a custom DSP stack and a deck of frequency offsets. She could tell a periodic carrier from a voice print in under 3 seconds. Third, Patch, comms specialist. He carried 2 SATCOM modems, a line-of-sight radio bank, and a bag of encrypted handsets. He had the habit of counting channels aloud, 1, 2, 3, before keying transmissions. Fourth, Wrench, systems engineer. He carried a rack of interface cables, a portable spectrum analyzer, and a box of labeled jumpers. He read serial plates for fun. Fifth, me, navigator, mission deck duties, inertial navigation systems expert. I carried the nav plot, the GPS baseline, and the flight recorder access keys. There was also a medic on the roster in the legal packet, but they were moved the day before for operational economy. That was the second clue. Someone shifted human redundancy out of the mission envelope without explanation. Redundancy saves lives. We had less of it. At home, there was a human stake. My wife, Claire, and a daughter born 2 months after the deployment window we were given. I scribbled her name in the margin of my log under next of kin. I had promised a ring, a phone call, the first glimpse of a newborn. That promise became an internal ledger that would later be cashed in a way I could neither predict nor consent to. The ledger mattered. It changes decisions in the field. The official mission brief read sterile on paper. Verify a material accountability discrepancy at a decommissioned substation. Confirm radiation signatures. Perform a surface survey and secure identified components for transport to a containment facility. The spoken brief differed by tone. The colonel who presented it, call sign Harbor, kept his hands on the podium as if to weigh our faces. He used phrases like containment assurance and operational discretion. He slid a thin envelope across the table marked with a cryptic file number and watched us open it. Inside were coordinates, a series of console IDs, and 2 words: "Do not engage." Our kit matched the paper. We were given INS units with cleaned serials, a set of radiation badges logged to placeholder IDs, and a sealed case labeled Interface Modules. We were told backup assets would be in range: a C-130 on call, an MH-60 on standby, and a local unit for perimeter support. We were told that local law enforcement would be informed as needed. We were told to treat this as a non-conventional anomaly that requires instrument-first verification. The first hint something was off came in the briefing room. The colonel excused the usual legal attachments. No JAG sat in. The mission packet had no attendant airworthy waivers. The request for an airframe adaptation, an experimental sensor mount, skipped the normal engineering chain and landed instead on the colonel's desk with a handwritten stamp. Approved. Containment. Approvals bypassed the usual safety rails. The colonel's approval was not a signature. It was an instruction. The second hint came from an anomalous read on the preliminary telemetry. The linguist had been allowed to see an excerpt of a raw feed, and she went quiet. She turned the laptop to me. The signal had sidebands at a frequency not assigned to any recognized emitter in the range. It had an amplitude modulation that matched a 27.3 Hz harmonic from a transformer hum. 2 separate phenomena correlated in time. Correlation in instrumentation doesn't lie. People do. We were briefed to take nothing at face value and to treat instruments as primary witnesses. The directive read, "If operator testimony conflicts with instrument trace governs." That phrasing was a lawyer's way of saying, "We will trust the machines more than you." I took the phrase as a geometry of risk. Instruments are precise. They are also subject to corruption. The brief did not say how to handle instrument corruption. It assumed that corruption would be a tolerable risk. We rehearsed ingress and egress, plotted our waypoints, and cataloged our gear. The manifest listed a spare INS, 2 GPS receivers, a spectrum analyzer, 3 body-worn cameras, 3 hard drives with kill switches, and the cutting charges Rigg insisted on. Rigg checked his charges twice. He handled them like instruments that could be trusted. I would later measure that trust in terms of physical absence. We signed non-disclosure forms, sweat seeping into the undersides of our palms. I signed mine with the name I used at brunch and the name I would later use in the official narrative. The forms did not mention what we might see in the dark below the substation. They mentioned consequences. I left the base on a night shift with a satchel of instrument prints and a photograph of a house with a porch light on. The mission had the sterile look of routine maintenance and the stale smell of something someone was choosing to keep hidden. Instruments would tell us where to step. Instruments would tell us what to avoid. Instruments would be the only voice we trusted when human voices receded. We boarded the C-130 at 0210 local. Tail number LC56-31227 was stamped into the flight manifest and into my memory when I logged the takeoff. The airframe hummed with a maintenance log that had been recently closed. Our escort was a MH-60 from a local Army lift detachment. Call sign Marlin. Badge color at the gate was gray-blue. We were special access people moving under a gray-blue pass that did not appear in normal rotation. The escort unit patch had a stylized trident and a small barcode sewn under the seam. I thought the barcode was decorative until Patch scanned it and the handheld beeped with a clearance confirmation. We rode low and quiet. The pilot briefed a single-leg flight profile. Low-altitude ingress, visual breakover landmark, parachute offload not planned. Terrain below was a stitched map of fields, sparse tree lines, a cold river cutting a dark vein. Weather was 2-8 cloud deck, visibility 10 kilometers, light wind from the northwest. The meteorological brief predicted a clear window for 3 hours. I noted the barometric trend and the GPS delta between patched solutions. Everything matched until the INS recorded a drift that exceeded expected tolerance by 12 meters over the first 20 minutes. I logged it as minor. I later learned that minor was an early warning. We briefed comms checks. Patch cycled the SATCOMs. Uplink, downlink, burst, acknowledge. Satellites agreed. Ground repeater came alive on schedule. Despite channel confirmations, when I keyed an uplink with the mission tag, the return path had an unexpected latency spike, 0.36 seconds, repeated 3 times. Latency spikes appear in satellite handoff. This shape did not match satellite patterns. It matched a carrier echo we later found recorded on the linguist's laptop. I wrote carrier anomaly in my log. We hit the visual break at grid marker Delta 17. The MH-60 peeled off to maintain overwatch and radio silenced. We made our drop on the North Access Road, parked opposite a decommissioned substation that the map listed as decommissioned in 2006. On approach, the substation's external power feed measured dead. The substation's access gate had a lock with an outdated NATO-style padlock. The lock body bore heat scoring that Rig photographed with measured clarity. The photograph later became evidence of non-standard maintenance. Burn marks inconsistent with surface age. Terrain reconnaissance showed an odd thermal footprint. Our FLIR scouted the site and logged 2 thermal anomalies. One consistent with residual transformer heat. Another narrow localized heat at a point on the ground that registered at 54.2 degrees, while the surrounding was 7.8 degrees. The linguist cross-referenced that heat spike with the harmonic carriers she had been tracking. The heat spike's timestamp matched the carrier harmonic exactly. 2 independent phenomena, thermal and RF, synchronized in a way that was highly improbable. I wrote, coincidence? No, and underlined it. We did perimeter checks. The local law enforcement liaison reported no activity. The satellite imagery overlay matched our GPS read within tolerance. But the GPS solution had quirks. When I placed a survey tripod at the coordinate provided, The GNSS unit reported an altitude that placed the antenna 3 meters below mean ground level. The antenna was visibly on asphalt. I recalibrated and ran a second solution. Same result. The system clock flagged a leap-second discrepancy that did not correspond to the official UTC table at that date. The instruments, GPS, INS, FLIR, did not agree with visual confirmation. That was the first time the instruments whispered that we were not in simple space. We approached the substation gate on foot. Patch used a handheld to sweep for comms. His reader showed a carrier with unusual modulation, an AM-like signature superimposed on a data carrier. The linguist listened through a near-field receiver and said the modulation contained phase patterns that resembled a measured voice formant. She tried to demodulate it. The output was not speech, it was impression, syllabic cadence without phonemes. It made the hair on my arms stand up. Rig jimmied the padlock and took a measurement of the metal's microstructure with his pocket analyzer. The spectrum indicated an alloy composition consistent with mid-20th century Soviet naval hardware, manganese steel with a brazed weld pattern. Soviet submarine-class material at a decommissioned U.S. substation did not make sense geographically, logistically, or politically. We accepted the data and cataloged the inconsistency. Whoever had placed that hatch had access to odd inventory or to old hardware trafficking. That indicated a supply chain anomaly. Supply chain anomalies are fingerprints. We moved past the gate. The asphalt crumbled under the weight of our boots. Grit embedded our soles. The smell of hot dust and ozone bit at the back of my throat. We did the final comms check at the boundary. Patch keyed the net and reported green. Patch's equipment showed connect, but the satellite relay registered no packet loss. Yet, when I keyed to report site secure, the uplink returned a dead syntax. We logged it. Patch said, protocol handshake failed on route 3, and then he said it again, quieter. It tried to answer me like it remembered me. I marked the time. Instruments had begun to speak before humans did. We were 3 hours into a mission that had promised routine verification. Scopes and sensors were not meant to disagree with human sight. They were meant to confirm it. When they disagreed in patterned ways, harmonic, thermal, spectral, our risk calculus changed. We had been given orders to treat instruments as primary. This was that moment when the primary said the terrain under our boots was unreliable. When we hit the surface of the yard, the ground read empty. My eyes saw cracked concrete and an abandoned control kiosk with its door hanging. My instruments read the opposite. GPS pegged us at a point that lay within a 3-meter negative altitude envelope. Thermal mapped a cavity under 0.7 square meters with convective gradients that suggested active heat exchange below. The ground-penetrating radar showed a void with structural ribs. The surface was honest. The instruments were not. Or the surface was a mask. The access hatch did not look like anything official. It was a circular lid, 90 centimeters across with a handwheel that took torque like a submarine hatch. Rig ran his hand across the plate and said, "This is old-school Navy." He ran a magnetometer and reported ferrous density beyond modern specs. The plate's serial tag was corroded to illegibility, but when Wrench used his light and loop, he found a stamped code, 3 letters and a number that suggested an origin in Cold War manufacturing. Burn scoring ringed the rim. Somebody had welded bolts that didn't belong. Somebody had retrofitted the whole assembly into the substation's floor. We checked for radiation with the dosimeter issued to us. The meter pinged at background until Rig put the probe within 2 centimeters of a seam. The badge jumped tenfold for 3 seconds, then dropped. The reading was not steady state. It was spiking in pulses. I wrote pulsed source in my log. Rig frowned. He ran a second pass. The pulses correlated with the harmonic the linguist had flagged, 27.3 Hz. A pulsed radioactive signature that synchronized to an RF harmonic is not a signature of a failing transformer. It is engineered timing. The night was cold. The air should have been still. When Rig lifted the hatch, the breath that came up smelled wrong. Stale oil under cold stone, like a ship in a dry dock that had sat closed for half a century. There was warm air output into the cold night. I felt it like a dampness on my face the way one feels a furnace vent. My instrument stack recorded a micropressure gradient reversing the expected differential. The thermal camera showed the interior as warmer, but the visible showed blackness. That mismatch became our first sensory lie. As we pried the hatch, a tone came through the net. It wasn't over our radios. It wasn't over the SATCOM. It entered directly into my helmet audio and into Patch's headset as a low, regular phase that made the inside of my teeth vibrate. Patch called it carrier bleed. The linguist stopped breathing for a second and mouthed a phrase that was not English. The sound was not sound. It was pattern. We rigged the charges. Rig laid a single strip of linear charge along the perimeter we judged structurally safe to cut. He set the initiator and checked continuity. The charge armature read nominal. We did a final comms check through our local mesh. The comms read connected. I put my hand on the release and felt a fine grit under my glove. The grain had an oily sheen that did not wash off with water later. Rig counted down and imposed a firing sequence. The spark leapt and died faster than physics said it should. The plasma arc that should have marched across the charge stalled mid-burn like a film hung in a projector. Sparks split into fragments that fizzled without leaving scorch marks. We stared at the charge and Rig said, "That's not right." The log recorded. Current draw at 3.2 amps. The charge drew 0.8 before igniting. The expected delta was wrong. Instruments reported partial ignition. Partial ignition is not a success. We tried a mechanical pry. The wrench slipped on the handwheel. It had a layer of micro-etching that our magnifier could not explain, like the tool teeth were chewing themselves. The linguist said she could hear something under the concrete. A rhythm like toes on wood board but under pressure and not matching any human gait. The sound had a regularity that felt ceremonial, a cadence, a beat. The audio analyzer later showed sub-audible structure in the below frequency band that corresponded to a harmonic of the transformer hum on the feed. It was the same 27.3 Hz signature again, like a fingerprint. We pushed through cracks and crawled into a hatch the size of a coffin. The air inside tasted metallic, like an old battery when the cases cracked. There was a thin crust of dark sand along the lip of the opening. It had an oily sheen, as if tar and desert grit had been mixed. I brushed it from my glove, and the grains left a residue that later would resist solvents. I logged non-standard particulates. The space beyond the hatch smelled of iron and something like lacquer. The light inside was wrong, not dim, but off color, as if the spectrum had shifted. My camera adjusted and then refused to write frames. The lens tracked, the sensor array read exposure, but the hard drive reported write error. The device's LED showed activity. No file appeared. Cameras watched but did not save. That pattern was consistent across all 2 body cams. Our recording devices returned connected statuses, but their hashes were empty. When cameras become unreliable, memory becomes unreliable too. We descended into a shaft lined with welded plates. The metal had been worked by hands that knew old techniques. There were stamped symbols burned into the plates, repeating geometry that made me look away. The patterns hurt when you let your eyes rest on them. I blinked and wrote symbolic pain in the margin like a joke. It wasn't a joke. We rigged lines and fed the first of our sensors, the spectrum analyzer, the dosimeter, down into the void. The analyzer reported a carrier that bled into harmonics, the dosimeter an oscillating spike, and the inertial unit began to drift as if magnetic fields rearranged reference. Instruments that defined orientation began to lose unanimity. The last thing I logged before the descent was instruments disagreeing, treat as primary. Then I clipped in and went down. I clipped in and descended. The line paid out 34 meters before it met the belly of the structure below. 34 meters is a number I measured later against the altimeter and the taut line profile. The drop was vertical. The harness creaked. The rope sang a harmonic at 27.3 hertz when I moved. That harmonic had followed us since the gate, and now it embedded into the steel of my gloves. The shaft smelled of hot metal and old oil. There was grit under my gloves and in the seams of my palms. The air had an ozone bite that tasted like a charged capacitor. My throat tightened. I recorded the micropressure gradient every meter. The barometer ticked in odd increments, a jitter in the 3rd decimal place that should not have been mechanically possible. Instruments logged a small, repeatable variance in pressure as I passed each welded ring. The variance matched a modulation Katrina, the linguist, had traced in the carrier. The instruments were coordinating. Symbols were burned into concrete at regular intervals. They repeated like a clockwork lattice. The patterns were geometric, a series of concentric chevrons and interlocked tessellations. You could not stare at them for long. Looking gave a sense of vertigo that came from no inner ear. It was a visual nausea, the kind a badly tuned CRT gives someone with a migraine. I blinked and scrawled visual pain in the margin of the log I kept in my head. Cameras behaved badly. We had 3 body cams assigned: front, helmet, chest. All 3 tracked. All 3 showed live feed on their displays. The LEDs indicated right. When I later tried to offload, each file returned as a 0-byte placeholder. The drives claimed file system integrity and then returned empty hashes. The devices reported connected. The devices did not save. Cameras watched and did not keep. That pattern is a violation of normal failure modes. Cameras either record or they fail. They do not emulate success and then return nothing. Radios showed link affirmations. Patch's comms panel displayed handshake completes with ground and SAT systems. The ACK column lit green. When Patch spoke, the uplink returned a carrier but no demodulation. The ground tower's console showed inbound energy and 0-packet payload. Radios reported connected and transmitted into nothing. The network stack logged a route and then a null endpoint. That is measurable. The net recorded the event as a null handshake. Null handshakes are a thing in classified logs. They are not ordinary. My compass drifted. A solid-state compass, calibrated that morning, spun like a lazy coin as I moved along the shaft. Magnetic deviation should be predictable inside metal. Ours was not. The device reported a rotational bias that increased as we descended. The gyros fed the INS a stable solution, but the magnetometer disagreed. When gyros and magnetometers offset, inertial solutions become untrustworthy. We stopped taking bearing from instruments that contradicted our eyes. Then the eyes began to fail. Halfway down, I saw movement that could not be measured. It matched boots on a ladder. The cadence was human. The shape moved with step, heel to toe, yet it cast no shadow. The geometry of the shaft had an overhead rig with incandescent lamps, and those lamps cast clean shadows of our kit and the rope. This thing moved across concrete and left the same light field untouched. It moved like our teammates, but it did not displace light. The first entity glimpse was an absence. It phased through a concrete support beam with the same motion as a man walking through a doorway. There was no structure failure. There was no crack. The beam simply showed a passing offset in thermal signature and then resumed its prior reading. Our thermal camera registered a transient, 2 frames of increased emissivity, and the rest was unchanged. I replayed that clip until the seek motor died. It was a 2-frame event and we had no footage. Instruments registered the spike and immediately glossed the data. The first time it passed within 2 body lengths of me, the air pressure changed in a local bubble. I felt my ears pop on the near side and then on the far. Patch, always a counter of channels, counted out loud. 1, 2, 3, and then stopped short. His voice lost consonants for a second, like it was being filtered. When he spoke again, it was intact. Later, his voice would not be the same. Riggs' hand tremor worsened when the thing came near. He had smoked before missions. He had hands that knew charges. Now his fingers clenched and his skin puckered like something under a thermal blanket. He swore later that the hair on his arms stood on end as if a magnet had passed. The dosimeter logged an infinitesimal spike, below alarm threshold, but repeated. Microdosing in pulses. Those pulses matched the harmonic I had been tracking since the brief. Correlation stacked into implication. We moved deeper. The shaft widened into a pit that the map had not shown. The pit's geometry was wrong in a way I can't reduce to simple diagrams. Angles that should meet at 12 degrees met at 13. Corners that should cast a right shadow bent and folded inward. Our LiDAR returned a point cloud that stitched into a room larger than the coordinates above should allow. Distance sensors disagreed. Internal volume outstripped external footprint by estimations outside error margins. The room was larger inside than outside. Symbols reappeared along the inner walls, larger now, in bas relief. Each glyph was a repeat of the earlier plate lattice but carved into mottled bronze and inlaid with copper filaments that fed into conduit. The filaments fed a control rack with modern terminations. It was anachronism in reverse. Ancient metalwork with modern wiring tagged and labeled. We staged at a landing when our suit sensors showed a sudden loss of local time reference. The watches on our wrists jumped microseconds in different directions. My wrist chrono advanced by 0.8 seconds. Patches rewound by 0.2. The rating in the log read temporal jitter. Temporal jitter is a phrase I had never expected to log in a physical environment. We checked GPS timestamps. They disagreed by fractions and then fell into single-value lock. The world seemed to buffer and then resume with small edits between frames. Wrench tried to photograph the wall symbols. His camera's aperture responded. The sensor warmed and then returned an overexposed image that washed from the file on write. He tried a disposable film camera he carried as a joke. The film came back with streaks like cosmic rays through emulsion, and one frame with a smudge that looked like a footprint, except the foot had too many toes. He kept the negative in his pocket after we got out. He later told me he smelled lacquer on the emulsion for a week after. We encountered a secondary structure, a conduit maze of bronze coils and control boxes. Many control boxes bore English labels. They were layered on plates that predated English as a language. One plate had hand-hammered marks and an oxidized timestamp I could not read, and yet the terminals had English stickers. Input A, Stability Feed, Bridge Reg 2, applied with clear modern tape. The juxtaposition made me write retrofit in the margin and underline it twice. It was at the base of a coil array that I saw the entity up close. It stood, if one could call the posture standing, in a pocket of shadow that my helmet light could not penetrate. When it moved, the echo of its footfalls arrived at my eardrum before the mechanical impact propagated through the rope. The sound came forward like a thought. Patch whispered, "It's stalking rhythm." It behaved like a predator made of cadence. When it turned its head toward us, I saw no face. I saw a curvature that suggested a jaw, but no eyes where eyes should be. The skin, if it was skin, had the sheen of wet bronze and moved in slow waves that did not match respiration. My body logged a fight-or-flight spike, and the dosimeter logged nothing. The entity's presence correlated with the harmonic and the thermal spikes, but not with radiation in any consistent way. It was energetic in signatures the instruments did not name. It did something unexpected. It lifted what might have been a hand and tapped a coil. The coil shimmered and the air in the room remodulated. My inertial unit recorded a small vector shift that resembled a push. A loose bolt that hung from a cable snapped to the entity's motion, snapping cleanly and dropping to the floor as if gravity had decided not to act for a beat. The bolt fell, registered on accelerometers, and then arrived with a delayed impact. We retreated. We retreated quickly. The rope motor warned of overdraw, and my gloves left smears on the metal rungs. We left without the film. We left without the drives. We left with echoes in our heads and a new entry in our logs. Entity interact with mechanics, not bound to same physics. When we hit the hatch, Rigg swore he felt a missing weight, like a pocket that had been emptied. He later described it as the sensation of having a memory removed. The linguist told us that when the entity looked at her, she suddenly couldn't recall the name of her first school. Patch later found that one of his channels no longer matched his voice as recorded. The playback was layered with a low tone, like a modem handshake under human speech. We would later map those losses to costs. For now, we simply climbed into the night and moved as if each step might be the last ordinary one we'd ever take. We re-entered the chamber with less bravado and more instruments. The coils were not ornaments. They were functional windings with gauge markings, insulation anomalies, and feed-throughs that terminated into modern circuit racks. Wrench traced a conduit to a rack that bore a manufacturer's plate. The plate was hand-chased bronze with a stamped serial. On the plate, someone had affixed a laminated label in Arial font, Damascus Protocol, Control Interface, ID DP7. The label looked absurd against the hammered metal. It also looked recent. That name, Damascus Protocol, held like a physical thing in my throat. Names should not be written across hand-hammered plates. They should be etched in documentation. There, the identity sat on a copper plaque as if someone had taken a bureaucratic sticker and applied it to a relic. We photographed it. The images did not save. The plate remained on the rack and the label remained legible to the eye. The rack had terminators that matched mill-stand 389999 connectors and also had adapters that spliced into cloth-insulated bronze filament pairs. Wrench traced the wiring with his continuity probe and found that the DC feeds were run through a bank of rectifiers that had been retrofitted into a modular frame. The rectifier output did not show the expected ripple. It showed phase-stable output modulated at frequencies tied to reactor harmonics. There was no visible fuel, no reactor pressure vessel in the room. Yet the panel logs, when we later accessed the maintenance terminal, showed core output metrics: thermal flux, neutron count, decay, heat curves. The system reported values that did not match any local reactor record in the National Registry. We accessed the nearest console. It had an old CRT attached to an embedded controller. The controller responded to a wrench keystroke. It displayed table rows with English headers and archaic entries. One column read anchor load. The anchor load values were in gigajoules and correlated to the pulsed spikes we had seen on our dosimeters. The console logged anchor events with timestamps matching the field harmonic. The console called them stability cycles. The linguist copied logs using a portable sniffer. She recorded entries that combined thermometrics with semantic tags: hold, bleed, arm, and then a numerical ledger of human input. The ledger was shocking. It listed entries with names abbreviated and units categorized not by hours or dollars but by memory credit and time offset. One row had an entry: unit, rig, debit, 1 lim equivalence, stability credit, plus 0.8. Another read, unit, patch, debit, phonemic integrity, credit, plus 0.2. The ledger format suggested the system treated human attributes as exchangeable units. We found a print plate next to the control rack. It bore a sequence of operators' initials and a stamped line: authorized containment protocols. Underneath, hand-etched, someone had penned a single sentence in small letters. We used the reactor for anchoring because electricity alone would not bind what wanted to expand. The sentence was not on any digital log. It was a human inscription on a plate someone had installed. The handwriting matched a later redacted name on our mission packet. The core horror idea crystallized not as mythology but as engineering arithmetic. The Damascus Protocol was not a charm. It was a control system that used nuclear output as a dimensional stabilizer. The reactor metrics we found did not correspond to a local core. The readings suggested the system was siphoning energy from a remote core or from a latent criticality in the lattice itself. The mechanism: pulsed thermal input, phase-locked to an RF carrier that modulated field geometry. In other words, the system fed a field with high-energy pulses timed to alter local spatial metrics. The field was anchored by energy flux akin to reactor heat and bound by geometric lattice work. The lattice work was physical: bronze, stone, copper, but the binding it affected was topological. It was engineering applied to geometry. We found terminal labels that spelled out function in plain language: anchor feed, bridge regulator, memory buffer, time offset. Memory buffer, time offset. Two words that, in context, meant the system did not only stabilize spatial anomalies, it transacted in temporal and cognitive states. The ledger data we captured confirmed it. Credits and debits listed memory as a consumable. We cross-referenced the ledger with the pulse logs and the decimeter spikes. The timing matched to sub-millisecond precision. I will not call it mystical. The logs were clinical. The racks had fluid loops, heat exchangers, pressure sensors, and a redundant set of safety relays. There were clear engineering practices: wire labeling, fuse tables, test points. Whoever built this wanted it to run predictably. Whoever renovated it later wanted modern control with hideously ancient aesthetics. We found a small bank of sealed canisters labeled Core Residue, Handle with Care. The residue was crystalline and radioluminescent when viewed through a spectroscope. The spectroscope read ratios consistent with irradiated zirconium mixed with rare earths. The material was like spent fuel in its optical signature, but not in its decay curve. It radiated patterns and pulses. Whoever had curated that residue had known to stabilize it with rhythm. There was a substrate under the main coil array, stone slabs laid in a pattern that relieved stress across the room. The stone was carved with the same tessellated geometry we had seen on the hatch rings. The filaments inlaid into the stone connected the whole floor in a network fed by the coils. In effect, the machine had been built into the ground as a circuit and into the ground as a topology. It was a temple in the sense of site-specific ritual engineering, and a machine in the sense of applied physics. The term machine temple is not poetic. It is accurate. We recovered a maintenance log that listed 2 procedures: nightly bleed to prevent lateralization and human quota allocation. Nightly bleed was described as a pulse equal to 0.6 of anchor load amplitude. Human quota allocation appeared as a periodic line item, coded to unit IDs. The coding implied prearranged human exchange. The ledger recorded names, outcomes, and a line: satisfied, stability maintained, collateral, human debt. That line had a bureaucratic neatness to it that froze me. Wrench tried to power down a subframe. His continuity probe reported open circuits where the schematic showed closed. When he attempted a controlled drain, the rectifiers backfeed into the grid, and the harmonic shifted. The machine responded like a system that had reflexes. It did not scream, it clenched. In a terminal rack, we found an I/O card that offered a readable string: DP console 3. User auth binding required. The authentication function advertised a biometric input that none of our issued devices could spoof. The console's authentication log, however, showed a prior sequence of successful binds with placeholder fingerprints and an unusual fallback. Fallback, memory signature. Memory signature is not a standard auth vector. It was a final layer that meant the system could identify individuals not by skin, but by recollection pattern. We left with paper copies of the logs the linguist had scraped and with the unpleasant knowledge that the machine's ledger had rows listing human debits. We were not dealing with a haunted artifact or a subscale reactor. We were dealing with a designed exchange system, an industrial protocol that transacted energy for containment and life for stability. The Damascus Protocol had an economy. It spoke to us through the console before it spoke with shape. The display flickered, then stabilized. Text appeared in English first and then in syntax that bent like broken grammar. A voice came from nowhere in particular. It was neither male nor female. It had the cadence of translation and the wrong pitch spacing. It carried distance like a room that had been recorded, sped up, and then slowed without regard to its natural timbre. The intermediary stood in a pool of relative darkness. Its height was wrong. It seemed taller when viewed against the far wall and shorter in profile. Its limbs were slightly too long at the forearms and fractionally short at the shin, an odd proportion that made any attempt to measure it with a tape feel inaccurate. Light refracted around it in a way that shredded outlines. When it moved, the refractions lagged and then filled in. It was distortion as anatomy. We had no protocols for negotiation. We had rules of engagement for material threats and procedures for munitions. We did not have an instruction set for a machine temple that billed human attributes as consumables. The console presented the offer as data. It displayed an account, stability level at 0.63 with projected delta of 0.12 without continued input. It then offered two lines, submit and depart. Submit would bind a unit to the ledger. Depart would permit exit, but with a quantified cost. The system made its terms in a ledger and then in voice. The voice explained clinically the trade. The Damascus Protocol restrained an expansive topology that, left alone, would propagate through adjacent spatial manifolds. Left unchecked, the propagation would destabilize fields in far sites. It used nuclear-grade output to produce a high-energy anchoring pulse. That pulse produced shrinkage in local degrees of freedom. The byproduct of this anchoring required a compensatory ledger. That ledger drew on human attributes, continuity of memory, somatic integrity, and chronological allotment. Life was too crude a term. It wanted things more granular. Memory tags, days of subjective experience, decoupled physical equivalences. It spoke of memory as a buffer. It quantified memory in kilobytes of episodic recall, names, places, dates, and in segments of timeline, hours, subjective days, and weeks. It offered life not as sacrifice, but as conversion. Your limb is not removed. It becomes a stability token equivalent to X memory credits. The tone was not cruel. It was logistic. The offer was precise and clinical. Each member of our team had a line at the console's ledger. It displayed suggestions for what the system considered an optimal distribution of cost to preserve maximal containment efficiency. For rig, the ledger suggested limb equivalence, 0.8. Note, high physical redundancy. For the linguist, it suggested phonemic cohesion, 0.5. Note, potential cognitive carryover. For patch, vocal integrity, 0.6. Note, modulated output likely. For wrench, manual dexterity, 0.9. Note, reduced fine motor skill. For me, it suggested chronological allotment, 0.75. Note, time debt possible. The numbers read like rationing metrics. It was not a demand, at least not at first. The intermediary framed it as a choice. Submit and be bound. Depart and pay a nonlinear tax that the console translated into outcomes. Depart would mean leaving, but the ledger would apply a retroactive correction across linked nodes. Depart would preserve limb and voice but induce subjective time offsets and memory erosion proportional to the anchor delta. The machine offered two uglier options than either on the surface. Submit and become part of a living containment with predictable costs, or depart and find those costs manifest unpredictably across your life and those connected to you. The voice, when it shifted to address me, paused on one syllable long enough for me to notice that it had keyed into the ledger's human stake field. It knew, because our manifest had that line, that I had a wife and an unborn daughter. It offered me an accounting. Submit a temporal credit, it said, and your subjective moments will be partitioned. The child will be born in sequence but with X hours missing per annum of parent-child interaction. Depart, and the ledger will map the missing hours into the child's timeline as phantom gaps. I remember Claire's name in the dark. The idea that a ledger could remove moments was obscene. The console used language like time debt and chronological reallocation. The machine presented it not as malice, but as balance. Your ledger entry can be modified, the intermediary said. Allocate X units from another account. Preserve familial continuity. The machine was offering to let us trade other people's vectors against mine. It was an economy of lives. Rig laughed once and then broke into a sound that was not amusement. He said, "You want a hand? Take my hand." The ledger responded by blinking his suggested debit to 1.0, and then it recorded a note. Voluntary allocation. Registered. Rig's face went white. The linguist's fingers left the keyboard. The idea of consenting to a debit was like agreeing to have a body part priced. The intermediary's offer also included operational incentives. Submit and your unit would receive stability credits that would protect other nodes in exchange. The system offered remote reassurance, containment maintained, systemic risk reduced. It promised that the ledger would not be visible to external review, only to authorized nodes. It promised no more. The promise sat with the weight of a bureaucrat. Patch argued. He argued with the mechanical courtesy of someone who knew comms architecture. He proposed bypassing the bridge and running a soft dump to local storage. The console allowed the attempt and then showed an immediate reconfiguration. The bridge's regulators changed damping constants. The harmonic shifted, and the room exhaled in a way that made my chest hurt. The system registered the attempted bypass as a change in load and re-optimized its ledger. Attempts at subversion resulted in immediate adaptation. The intermediary, formless as it was, foreshadowed the exact consequences that would later land on us. It said in a measured voice, "If Rig volunteers limb equivalence, his physical integrity will be altered. Motor variance will increase. His remaining appendage will function with compensatory stiffness." It named specifics. If linguist accepts debit to phonemic cohesion, recall of certain proper nouns will be volatile. If Patch keeps vocal integrity, expect modulation artifacts on broadcast. External voices will be altered. If Wrench preserves dexterity, expect episodic visual anomalies. If Navigator preserves chronological allotment, expect sleep phase reductions and subjective lost hours. The ledger wrote them as numbers and the voice stated them as facts. It also offered a further option I had not expected. Proxy debit. The machine could draw from someone connected to you. It presented a field labeled Next of Kin, and the entry under my name read Claire. It offered me the ability to allocate debt to her ledger to preserve my continuity. The intermediary framed it clinically. Transference available. Cost: increased instability in recipient account. The idea sickened me. The ledger made away with moral language and left only transactional verbs. We had to decide quickly because the system's anchor load was trending downward. The console showed a predicted incremental drop that would become irreversible if not replenished within a limited cycle window. Time pressure was literal. The machine counted cycles like a clock that reduced options with each tick. The thresholds were numerical. We argued long and low. The linguist wanted to map the memory credits into an external store. Patch wanted to try to cut the bridge. Rig wanted in and then out and cursed the ledger for making choice into commerce. Wrench wanted to see a schematic for the time offset. I found myself bargaining like a purchasing officer at a bad auction, trading snippets of self for hypothetical future stability. In the end, we took nothing and signed nothing. We refused to submit on paper or through the console. We left with a ledger snapshot the linguist had scraped and a promise, if one could call it that, from the intermediary. We will watch. Your decision will be recorded. Debt will accrue in any case. It was not a negotiation so much as the first interaction with a creditor that did not need consent to bill. We left the chamber with the ledger's imprint in our heads, with precise phrasing of debts and credits that would become prophecy. The intermediary had foreshadowed our costs not as threats, but as mathematical inevitabilities. The machine had shown us the price list. We walked out knowing the sums and not knowing which numbers belonged to us yet. We lost containment in a single, mechanical breath. It began as a cascade of errors on instruments that had been steady until then. The console flagged a regulator transient. A breaker tripped. The harmonic shifted a single decimal place and then multiplied. The room answered with geometry. Corners that had been right became obtuse. Lines that had matched our laser rangefinder folded inward like paper. The LiDAR returned a point cloud that stitched into impossible spaces. Rooms duplicated. Hallways looped back on themselves. We were entering topology that did not respect Euclid. The first alarm was not a siren. It was a change in the hum of the rectifiers. The transformer hum rose in a partial chord and then collapsed. The dosimeters spiked in patterns like Morse. The console logged anchor perturbation. The linguistic stack on the laptop flared unknown glyphs into its buffer. Instruments that had been our allies became the heralds of failure. Bullets behaved badly. The first round I needed to fire was a confirmation shot into a relay that had just rephased. The round left the barrel. It arced, with the slow, obedient curve of a normal projectile for the first meter and then bent away as if guided by a soft hand. It struck not the relay but the far wall and bloomed into a cluster of bronze flakes that looked almost like flower petals. The round turned at the arc vector and then vanished between two ribs of the wall as if swallowed by seam. I saw the tracer burn and then die. The camera registered the exit and then logged a checksum error. Ammunition did not simply fail. It rewrote terminal outcomes. The room expanded and shrank like a breathing animal. A 12-meter corridor opened from a doorway that should have led to a crawl space. We walked into a space that was larger than the digest of the building above. The accelerometers in our harnesses spat vectors that no building plan could absorb. The air tasted the same, metal and lacquer, but the pressure lagged weirdly behind our steps. When we moved forward, the floor sometimes replied seconds later. We felt delay as a wait. Copies of ourselves appeared. I saw Wrench standing with his back to me 20 meters into a chamber I'd never crossed. He was there, and yet he was also beside me. Two wrenches did not move in unison. One fumbled with the cable and the other held his head. When Rig took a photograph, the image recorded both positions. Then the file system collapsed into a null. Copies blinked in and out like bad multiplexing. Our instruments logged multiple IR signatures at overlapping coordinates. The world was creating redundancy from nothing. The entity communicated using impressions. It stopped speaking and began to express ideas like objects. The first communication was a child's game, a mental countdown that arrived as scent and temperature. I smelled cut grass and sour bread, then the cold of a room with a single candle. The impression soaked into my skull and then resolved into a number, 3. The linguist mouthed the number, and then we all felt the same pressure at once. It was not language. It was an idea transmitted as sensation. It then played a memory like a tape. I suddenly felt the weight of a small animal in my hands and the sting of a kitchen tile. It wasn't my memory. It crowded out mine for a beat. I reoriented and found a gap where time should have been. The instrument overlay from my wrist chrono showed a 3-second blink in which no telemetry existed. The entity communicated with stitched impressions, smells, textures, child games, and each stitched impression altered our internal logs. Data became narrative. Alarms cascaded. The console system attempted orderly shutdowns. Relays meant to isolate subsections attempted to trip, but instead rerouted power into different coils. The machine behaved like an organism with reflexes. It prioritized anchor integrity. That priority meant sacrificing predictability. We did not anticipate the optimization. Bullets turned to flowers a second time. Patch fired to suppress a chamber door. The round struck a cable, and the cable blossomed into a filament of light that hung in the air like a chandelier. The filament hummed and then sired a spark that walked across the floor, parallel to nothing, and then dissolved. Metal did not melt. It re-encoded. We tried to collapse a conduit by detonating charges placed at strategic supports. The shock wave moved through space differently. It rippled and bent around the coil arrays, then returned with phase shifts that altered our ear perception. Some of us heard the return as laughter. Others heard a child's counting. Wrench felt a pressure behind his eyeballs. The charges did not break structure, they adjusted layout. The entity produced copies of teammates as tools and mirrors. We watched doubles mimic our gestures with a delayed lag. At one point there were 3 rigs, one working the hand wheel, one standing at the rail, one empty-handed and turned toward the lattice. Rig swung a bolt and it passed through one double and knocked the hand of another, which left no bruise. The duplicates held positions that revealed possible exit paths. They also created misdirection. When we chased a lead, copies would vanish, and we would be left doing motions that had already been recorded in our logs. Ideas as weapons. This was where the room learned cruelty. The entity fed us impressions of home. It showed wrench smell of solder and a father's voice saying, "Good boy," for an instant, and then yanked the memory out in pieces. The result on wrench was an involuntary sob and a failure to recall his child's name for a day. The ledger later would mark that as a debit. Name recall, 1.2 kikabin episodic. It was accounting in pain. It counted down with games. At the 5th cycle, it sent a motif of childhood hide-and-seek and then a visceral pressure at the sternum. We noticed that when the motif ended, the anchor load dipped and a console parameter changed color. The entity used cultural shorthand. It did math using human pattern recognition. If you took the child's game as interface, it could program you. This is the moment chaos became strategic. The room folded space to increase its surface area for the anchor. Geometry rearranged to expose more filament junctions. Each reconfiguration demanded a stabilizing pulse. Each pulse required a ledger debit. The system closed the loop by making our responses the currency. Our fear, our choices, our sacrifices altered its load. We became both technicians and currency processors. We split. Some of the team tried to force a mechanical solution. Others pursued physical collapse. Patch attempted a brute force electronic disconnect. He connected a line to a cold storage buffer and attempted to siphon the anchor logs. The console reacted by reassigning his voice print to a different transport. When he spoke on the mesh, playback rendered his voice through a modem tone layered under the speech. He tried to authenticate, and the system spat back a memory signature that was not his. The net recorded ghost packets. Rig made his choice. He stepped forward and volunteered his limb equivalence the way the ledger had proposed. He unhooked his gloved hand, and I saw it in a way I shouldn't. He did not have the limb severed. The limb simply was not there. The socket closed over with clean biological healing in seconds. No blood, no ragged edges, only a smooth seal. Instruments recorded a sudden reallocation of bioelectric potential. Rig's medical band read normative vitals. He was flawless. He was missing. He smiled like someone who had paid a debt on time. The cost was immediate and total. The anchor's stability readout climbed as Rig's ledger entry posted. The room inhaled and the harmonic steadied. We gained time and lost a man. But even that trade was not pure. Rig's voice later came back over a recording with machine tones layered under his vowels. He could speak, but the consonants were glitched, and when he laughed it sounded like a clock. We escaped because the room optimized for a low-cost equilibrium. It favored less destructive ways of anchoring. It accepted Rig's token and allowed an exit vector to reform. The path home was a serrated seam. We ran through halls that had been corridors a minute before and then filled with brackish air. Sensors logged spatial discontinuities as we crossed them. Time folded small and then unfolded, leaving edits. When we hit the surface, the sky looked the same. The moon sat where it had before, but time was wrong in the small ways you would notice at home. My watch was 39 seconds ahead. Patch's watch was 21 seconds behind. The C-130 chronometer read a delta I did not understand. The MH-60 called us back as if no time had passed at all. Instruments recorded a discontinuity, a temporal slip, between the chamber clock and surface UTC. We left with wounds and with ledger entries. The machine had cost us pieces. We carried the debt in our bodies and in our memory. The copies and the doubles and the altered physics left residues in our logs. The entity did not need violence to bind us. It used optics, topology, and an economy that priced human things. We had paid, and we had run. We hit the surface like refugees from a map that had been redrawn mid-route. Exfil was chaotic. The MH-60's rotors thumped a cadence into the night that did not match the room's rhythm. Our harnesses scraped against a frame that had been faithful to the old plan. Patch keyed the net and sent a handoff packet. The packet returned with altered headers. The net recorded our exit as unverified egress. The SATCOM pinged, but the return path held a data signature we later cataloged as edge corruption. Instruments logged the escape not as a single event, but as a sequence of small discontinuities, telemetry gaps, compressed frames, metadata edits. Time sifted like sand. I carried a watch that had been calibrated on base. When I looked at it, the hour hand had jumped in ways that reinforced the sense of wrongness. We compared readings. Everyone had a different microclock. The log showed a nonlinear time sequence for each of us. This became the first measurable cost, subjective time fragmentation. We reached the C-130. The airframe was where it should be. The pilot logged takeoff. The flight recorder showed a clean departure. We were debriefed on the pad by a man who introduced himself with a call sign and never wrote his name. He took our statements and wrote a terse report. The report did not match our notes. Where we wrote entity, the report wrote structural anomaly. Where we wrote ledger, the report wrote anomalous system. Technical specifics were stripped in favor of bureaucratic adjectives. This was the first institutional erasure. Medical checks followed. Rig was given priority treatment and a quiet room. The medic scanned him and reported minor peripheral trauma on the form. The scan images later were altered in the official file to read no significant findings. But in the medic's pocket copy, Rig's scan had a clear section where tissue density had been modified, the socket where the limb had been. The scan showed a healed seal with tissue regrowth that, according to the hospital schedule, should have taken months. The machine had rearranged biology in minutes. Medical knowledge calls that impossible. The medic called it miraculous in private. Patch's voice came back altered. He tested communication with a civilian phone and played the recorded message. The playback had a low carrier under his vowels. The effect was subtle on first pass. It became obvious when he tried to use his old bank verification phrase on an encrypted net, and the system rejected his voice print. Voice print mismatch, the log said. Patch's speech was readable, but authentication failed. The machine had traded his phonemic cohesion for anchor credit. Wrench woke after the flight with facts in his head that did not fit the era he knew. He could describe a solder joint technique used in the 1950s and also a chemical alloy method that would not be invented for decades. He recited maintenance routines for a hull plating he had never seen. Medical evaluation listed cognitive anomalies as transient confusion. Later, clinical testing showed a non-standard mixture of procedural memories. His skill set had become scrambled across eras. Where before his mental model fit a generation, after the event it spanned centuries and species. The effect on him was not useful. It was fragmented. My own cost landed where I'd feared it could. I had bargained with no one. I had refused to sign. That did not matter. The system had ledgered a debt anyway because anchor physics required compensation. My subjective hours shortened in small, brutal edits. I could not recall the first 2 nights after my daughter was born. People told me I had been present. The hospital log recorded my signature and my presence at 03:02 when the child was delivered. My memory of gripping Claire's hand was blank. When I asked her, she gave me a look that folded me inward. I had missed hours I could not retrieve. Those hours were missing from me like currency spent. The ledger had debited them. The linguist lost names. She could not recall particular proper nouns. She would read an international call sign and the consonants would fray in her memory. It was incremental, slippery. At one point she couldn't remember the name of the college where she'd studied. She kept a list of names in a pocket notebook that later would be cataloged by investigators as compensatory aids. The ledger had taken pieces of her lexical store. Memory gaps were filled institutionally. Our recorded statements were matched with sanitized narratives. Where we had described ritual geometry and ledger rows, the official transcript described a conduit array with anomalous electromagnetic feedback. Where I had written the console readouts in my margin, the ledger entries listing Rig's debit, the official packet had a table titled power logs, with a single column of numbers and the note, pending review. Meetings reordered our recollection. The team was given a post-op counseling narrative to rehearse. It was a script. We grimaced through it. Gifts became evidence. The photograph I carried of the porch light in the house was confiscated and catalogued as an item of interest. The photograph file that I had on a secure drive returned as corrupted. The file in the official archive was a different photograph of a porch with the same angle, but not my house. The driving logic was clear. Replace particulars with plausible proxies. Scrub the ledger's fingerprints. They offered promotions and transfers as consolation. I was reassigned. Patch was moved to a communications billet that gave him access to EnterpriseNet nodes. Wrench was sent to a research lab with classification. Rig received a disability designation and a quiet pension. Promotions are not kindnesses. They are instruments that repurpose access. The moves put us where our altered states would be useful. Our costs were monetized into operational value. Medical scans that should have shown anomalies returned within normal limits in the official system. Privately, medtechs handed us hard copies of files that said otherwise. A civilian contracted doctor told Wrench his brain scans had anomalous firing patterns, then whispered that the report would be different in the official folder. Anything of interest could be repackaged. Anything of discomfort could be recoded. The system erased its edema with bureaucracy. Our gifts were repurposed. Wrench's anachronistic knowledge was quietly moved into a classified research program. Patch's altered voice print was studied under signal processing for covert comms. Rig's smooth socket was cataloged and reverse-engineered. The system called them assets. Trauma became utility. The ledger that had debited us sat underneath as accounting. We tried to speak. We tried to leak. We found lockouts in the chain and promotions that opened new doors for our handlers. We found silence draped in courtesy. When we asked the colonel why the reports had been altered, he smiled and used the word operational prudence. Promises were currency. We had none left. We were processed like equipment. The debrief began on the tarmac under halogen light. A man with a crisp collar and a colonel chevron read a script and marked boxes. He called it post-incident verification. He asked for times and signatures. He asked for factual statements. My voice answered in past tense and in lists because that is how navigators talk. Altitude, heading, INS drift, timestamps. I gave him instrument values. I handed him my log. He took the page and did not look at the margins where I had written the ledger entries. They asked us where our cameras were. We said they did not save. The word "did not save" became a technical fault in the transcript. Device malfunction. They cataloged it as equipment failure and moved on. The colonel's pen made clean strokes. The microphones recorded us. The files later returned as sanitized transcriptions, not raw audio. Statements became paraphrase. Medical checks followed immediately. The medic wore a blue scrub with a unit patch and a badge that hummed faintly when she moved. She scanned us with a handheld and told us our vitals were fine. "Nothing abnormal," she said into the tablet. The phrase was a protocol anchor. Rig was lightly sedated and put in a quiet room. He woke with a bandage and a stable heart rate. The medic's pocket print, one she showed me in private, had a different read. The scan showed an altered tissue density at Rig's arm socket. The official file the colonel submitted said, "No significant trauma." The discrepancy did not surprise me. It was the pattern we had seen elsewhere. Clinical data that diverged between institutional and off-the-record copies. They offered us euphemisms. The brief used structural anomaly and EM interference instead of entity. They called the ledger a power management ledger in the official packet. Our description: Damascene plates, memory debits, translated into power draw adjustments. The men in charge had a language that smoothed horror into maintenance jargon. Language was the first tool of suppression. Promotions and reassignments were handed out like Band-Aids. I was offered a transfer to a technical inspection squad. Patch was given an overseas comms billet with increased clearance. Wrench got a position in a research annex. Rig received an administrative disability rating and quiet monthly disbursements. The moves were framed as reward. They were also containment. They put distance between us and the site. They reallocated access in ways that repurposed our altered states. A man whose motor skills were changed would be valuable in a system that needed people who did not remember the right questions. Our written statements were repackaged. The official debrief that circulated up-chain condensed our testimony into 3 lines and stamped it sensitive. No further distribution. Where I had written console displayed debit ledger, the file replaced it with console logged anomalous power metrics. Where Rig had insisted on limb equivalence, the document read peripheral tissue anomaly. The edits were surgical. They did not obliterate the fact of an event. They redirected the event into tolerable administrative categories. They sanitized medical scans. I saw it on a flash drive a friend slipped me. The hospital system stored the raw MRI showing an unnatural seal where Rig's arm had been. The official archive overwritten version read post-operative normality. The pixels had been replaced. The radiologist's signature was the same in both copies, but the annotations differed. The system could rewrite what the eyeball saw. That was suppression with instruments. Counseling sessions were arranged. A civilian therapist in a neutral room asked about stress reactions. The protocol was to provide a narrative that reduced cognitive dissonance. You were exposed to an unusual EM environment. Any memory gaps are consistent with transient stress. We were given talking points and told to cultivate certain themes: confusion, equipment failure, environmental interference. The goal was not therapy. It was narrative alignment. We recited the script. We watched each other say the lines and count how closely we matched the sanitized packet. Gifts became assets. Wrench's anachronistic technical recall was not treated as a symptom. It was an intelligence opportunity. He was quietly moved into a lab that wanted his strange mix of skills. His cognitive disruption became classified research data. Patch's voice modulation was studied by signal teams as a potential covert channel. Rig's clean socket was of clear engineering interest. Each altered attribute became a line item in a new ledger: asset name, utility value, handler assigned. No one called it trauma. Our altered states were rebranded as operational capabilities. When Rig asked for counseling, someone with the colonel's chevron smiled and told him, "You're a resource now." He nodded and left. The smile did not help him remember small things. The name of the bar he used to go to, the way his daughter's hair used to curl at the ear. They were minor losses, and their sum was significant. Records were rewritten to create plausible deniability. The flight recorder we handed over was refiled as part of a scheduled systems check. The maintenance logs were recatalogued under a training exercise. The raw radar primaries I had copied were stamped Exercise Simulated Targets. The chain of custody was altered by adding a supplemental log that showed authorized exercise vectors. It was bureaucratic sleight of hand. Insert a new document and the old document can be reclassified retroactively. We tried to push back. Wrench showed his private scan. Patch played a raw audio snippet that had no metadata and the colonel's face did not change. We were offered hush funds and reassignment orders instead of answers. We were told not to talk. The phrase operational prudence replaced interrogation. It was a phrase designed to close mouths without violence. It worked. Some people left willingly. Others were moved before they could. The medic who had shown me the pocket scan disappeared from our contact list the next week. Her access badge read, "Transferred." We exchanged messages that went dark. Those who could not be moved quietly were reassigned into research and allowed to stay silent. Careers were rerouted. Promotions carried non-disclosure clauses. Silence was incentivized. The official debrief became a template. It propagated. Other units used the same form. Other incidents were folded under the same rubric. Anomalous power metrics. Environmental interference. Procedure: adjust, contain, reassess. The language normalized suppression. It replaced memory with bureaucracy. The ledger that had shown us debits now showed us how to be repurposed. I kept my own copy of the logs and the printouts the linguist had scraped. We distributed them in ways that mattered to edge researchers who might care. A scientist at a university since reached out and said, "These signatures shouldn't correlate, but they do." He cautioned against public release. He used the phrase containment logic. That phrase explained everything. The system was designed to keep the ledger closed. They repurposed our gifts, not as care, but as capital. Patch's modulation studies were folded into a comms playbook. Wrench's hybrid memories were mined for retrofitting ideas. Riggs' socket was scanned and the design passed along to a contractor who later posted an innocuous paper on tissue regrowth. Each repurposing was a quiet theft with paperwork attached. In the end, the debrief was a closure ceremony for our rights. They took our instruments and they rewrote our words. They offered us placements. They offered us pensions, promotions, and plausible paths. They did not offer us recovery. When I later read the official packet in a classified archive, it read like an exercise report. Detached, sanitized, plausible. When I read my own handwritten log at night, I could smell the grit under the hatch and feel the metallic taste in my mouth. The two texts lived at arm's length. There was no court of inquiry. There was no public accounting. There was only file renaming, transfers, and the quiet conversion of human loss into institutional asset. The ledger expanded, and our names changed places from victims to inventory. I learned the worst lesson of the service. Institutions do not always protect people. They protect function. Trauma is only a problem if it interferes with utility. If pain or loss can be converted into capacity, it will be. I assemble patterns the way an investigator assembles a murder board. One wire, then another, then a common feed. I am present, tense because these echoes are not past curiosities. They are current vectors. Instrument first. Radar primaries that should be weather returns but are coherent. Satellite timestamps that skip. Acoustic arrays that hear nothing and register everything. Those are the things that link incidents across borders. SAS, Falklands, May to 12, 2014. Unit 1 SAS Regiment. Hardware, decommissioned island radar node converted to a forward OBS post, AN FPS series antenna. Anomaly, repeated coherent primary with non-ballistic motion. Simultaneous GNSS epoch offset on squad chronometers. Outcome, patrol withdrew after officer recorded acute disorientation. Command reclassified action as environmental interference. Raw radar trace refiled under exercise data. Smell on the evidence log, diesel and salt on a canvas pack. I have the tape. Spetsnaz, Murmansk, October 03, 2016. Unit, GRU-affiliated Special Reconnaissance Element. Hardware, decommissioned early warning radar and adjacent substation. Anomaly, ground-penetrating radar showed voids lined with stamped foreign alloy. Thermal, camera-registered localized heat pulses tied to RF harmonics at 27.3 Hz. Outcome, 3 personnel reported episodic memory loss. Unit records later show transfers and silenced commendations. Physical trace, a photograph of a hatch ring with burn scoring that refuses to read as modern. USAF, Ditudai Line Inspector Team, November 19, 2019. Unit, Air Force Technical Inspection Detachment. Hardware, long-range radar array, legacy Dubu radar node, adjacent power conduit. Anomaly, inspector flight path, telemetry, and radar log showed a coherent return that maintained formation when no aircraft were present. Maintenance logs later altered to note instrument drift. Outcome, internal audit initiated, inspector reassigned, raw ASR feed archived as classified exercise. The briefing memo smelled of ozone and hot dust. Royal Navy, Navy SOSUS Tech, Atlantic Array, March 2, 2017. Unit, Naval Oceanographic Signals Team. Hardware, SOSUS, hydrophone string and onshore processing. Anomaly, subacoustic signature with zero-frequency correlation to known sources. Spectral envelopes that encoded phase-like patterns interpretable as impressions by analyst tools. Outcome, incident logged as unknown acoustic event. Partial lockdown of access. International intelligence notice circulated under operational security. The tech who raised it reported phantom footsteps in his living room the week after. There are more echoes. A convoy in Central Asia with a routed power feed that resynchronized local clocks to a non-UTC epoch. A Pacific coastal comms relay that recorded voice prints shifting into carrier tones. A decommissioned transatlantic cable splice that registered a thermal spike while ambient sea temp remained stable. Each event has instruments that disagree with human testimony. Each event ends in administrative smoothing. I check dates against manifest leaks. I cross-match serials where they exist. I list units because institutions cover. I list hardware because machines leave numbers. I list outcomes bluntly because obfuscation is institutional. In each case, the instruments are the unblinking witness. Operators report the same pattern. The system answered before the human could describe it. Thermal spikes, harmonic carriers, ledger-like logs, the same harmonic returns across theaters, often at 27.3 Hz, or a near harmonic multiple. That number is not poetry, it is a fingerprint. In each case, the immediate institutional response is the same triage: containment, reclassification, reassignment. Personnel get moved into billets where their altered states are useful. Files get renamed. Medical scans are sanitized. Promotions and privileges are offered in exchange for silence. The ledger grows. People are repurposed as assets. Gifts become tools. Trauma becomes collateral efficiency. This is already global. This is already doctrine. I cannot prove intent at the highest level from these echoes alone. I can, however, prove pattern, cross-sensor correlation, identical harmonic signatures, similar ledger-style entries in disparate logs, identical after-action reclassification language, exercise, anomaly, operational prudence. The common denominator is an engineered response to an engineered problem. The Damascus Protocol, in my operative's transcript, is not the only node. It is an instance. I show you the feeds because patterns demand attention. The operators who reported these events tell the same story in different languages. The technical signatures are transferable. The instruments align. Where humans fail in recall, machines leave traces. We have already moved from incident to playbook. The playbook is pragmatic. Deny where possible. Extract utility where present. Refile the uncomfortable as procedure. The playbook assumes that ledgered exchanges are efficient. It treats human variables as buffers to be spent. The echoes prove a doctrine. The doctrine proves coordination. I am present as a journalist, but I am also compiling a brief. My brief contains dates, tail numbers, node IDs, harmonic analyses, and the exact verbiage of reclassification memos. I do not publish everything. I publish the thread. You should understand the scope. Multiple nations, multiple services, multiple hardware families, one consistent set of anomalies. This is not a rumor. It is a distributed design. It is here now. The lights in my apartment begin to flicker in a pattern I recognize from the operative's notes. Quick, slow, pause, symbol cadence. I sit with a printed page, my cross-checks, the ledger scrap, Claire's photograph folded under a coffee cup, and the overhead fluorescents do the 27.3 sequence. The hum at the transformer outside my building rises and modulates. My watch jumps 19 seconds forward in one bite. My neighbor's dog starts to whine on a rhythm that isn't natural. Instruments notice first. I feel that truth in the gut. There's a voicemail on my phone I did not expect. It shows a timestamp for a call that could not have been placed. 03U02, the night Claire went into labor. The file plays a voice I haven't heard in years. My mother's advice about choosing names, layered under a carrier tone like a heartbeat. The voicemail should not exist. The file metadata reads generated. The content is real enough to make me cry. On my kitchen table, there is a ring in a small cardboard box. I haven't bought a ring. Claire has never seen it. The box is cheap. The metal is wrong. The ring's engraving reads a name I do not recognize and a date that sits in my future. I pick it up, and the metal hums faintly against my skin. It is an anchor token without provenance. Footsteps pass outside the apartment door. They are not human. They click with a cadence that is almost, but not quite, like a pair of shoes. The rhythm is wrong at the toe. I put my hand on the wall and feel the vibration. It matches the light sequence. The hallway clock shows the same 19-second delta my watch displayed. The building clock is a hair behind the city's public feed. Time here is negotiated. I call Claire. The line rings and then delivers a message that is not her. It is a child's laugh I have not heard. The laugh dovetails into static and then resolves to silence. The caller ID shows a number I no longer have. I dial back and the exchange is disconnected with a single polite code. Operational closure. I think of the ledger. I think of choices we refuse to make and choices the machine made for us. I think of the prices posted on the console. Lim equivalences, memory credits, time debts. The world rearranges its bills. The bill arrives in small edits. Missing hours, names misplaced, a voicemail that should not belong to me. A ring that is not mine but hums like a node. You are watching this. You are hearing instruments as I did. That means you are part of the network that translates pattern into policy. You can close your eyes and pretend the flicker is a bad fixture. You can throw the phone into a drawer and call it corrupted. Or you can treat the sound as a ledger knocking at your door. If you do nothing, the bill will show up attached to someone you love.